Okay, I think we are ready to start. Good afternoon. First, let me express my appreciation to all of our distinguished speakers, as well as participants, for joining us today for this roundtable session. I'd also like to congratulate the Czech Republic for its 15th anniversary of becoming a full member of the European Space Agency. In March 2022, PSSI organized its inaugural event on Indo-Pacific Partnerships in Space Security. It sought to set the stage for an important ongoing discussion on how engagement with partners in the space sector can promote the principles of democracy, the rule of law, respect for human rights and international law, combat unfair trade practices in the space sector, and promote an open and rules-based regional security architecture. As military tensions in the Pacific region continue to rise, witness Pyongyang's successful launch of a military satellite just last week, the need to establish stable and sustainable access to and use of space becomes ever more urgent. Japan, India, South Korea, and other regional players are making significant strides and investments in space capabilities, as are authoritarian space powers. Having just returned from Seoul, I can tell you that the energy and priority being accorded to the development of South Korea's space security portfolio is most impressive and laudable. The US and Japan held its first space engagement talks in July, and this month, the US, Japan, and South Korea held their first trilateral working level talks on how to boost cooperation in space security. Earlier in the year, Washington set its apprehensions aside and has entered with India into a new strategic technology partnership, and the two countries are seeking to strengthen collaboration on human spaceflight, commercial collaboration, and space exploration. Australia and the United States signed a technology safeguards agreement in October, allowing US companies to conduct space launch activities in Australia while protecting sensitive US space technology. Meanwhile, there are signs of tightening collaboration between Russia and China, as evidenced during the Belt and Road Summit in October. Similarly, Russia and North Korea have embarked on a deeper space partnership, memorialized at the Vostochny Cosmodrome in September. Imagine the recklessness of such a move on the part of Moscow, but sadly, not surprising. In short, the deteriorating geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific region is reflected in the space domain. Fortunately, much is being done to mitigate the growing risks involved by the strengthening the existing space security strategies and the forging of new ones. Our distinguished panelists for this session are Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Dr. Namrata Goswami, Professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University, Mr. Hermann Ludwig Müller, Director of the European Space Policy Institute, and Dr. Kazuto Suzuki, Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. Dr. Raji Rajagopalan regrettably cannot join us as she was taken down with a bad case of flu. But I certainly think we have a very starry panel, and we'll have a lot to discuss. Our panelists will provide their expert take on the existing dynamic in the regional space security, some of the most significant developments over the past year, some of which I mentioned, as well as how they view the current global space race. We also prepared an interactive tool called Mentimeter, which will enable you to engage anonymously during the roundtable. This is, of course, a voluntary undertaking. Finally, you can ask questions at any time through the Q&A option on the Zoom platform, and I will convey them to the speakers. So with these remarks, I would like to give floor to Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Jana. It's great to be here. Good evening from Canberra, where it's just gone 11 p.m. I am very privileged to be able to give my perspectives on Indo-Pacific space activities, including Australian space activities. And I think it's important to note that a mere 10 years ago in Australia, we had a policy called the Satellite Utilisation Policy, which basically said, effectively, Australia has no need for its own satellites, no need for space launch. We just rely on others to provide everything for us. 10 years later, in 2023, we've been 1 year from launching Australian satellites on Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch sites. We're building our own satellites. We're developing a full end-to-end space ecosystem. We have a space agency and a defense space command. So we've come a long way in those 10 years. And I think primarily because government has listened to the private sector and has become aware that space need not cost hundreds of billions of dollars. It can be driven by the commercial sector and provide real benefits in terms of rapidly growing a key sector of our economy, create jobs and prosperity, as well as contribute to our defense and national security. Tonight, I want to give you my perspectives on where things are headed in the Indo-Pacific region and also Australia's activities. And I think that let's start with 4 important big themes that I think are really significant. First is the challenge posed by China's space ambitions. Clearly, China seeks to be a world-class space power, certainly by 2049, if not well before then. It seeks to be a dominant space actor, challenging US space primacy in space, but also utilizing that growing capability that takes China not only from low Earth orbit, but to the lunar surface by 2030. So that it's about Chinese astrostrategic power and establishing a space economy on and around the moon and around the Earth. And that then prompts Chinese power on Earth by establishing what they call a space Silk Road to expand Chinese influence, utilizing space capabilities. Second big theme, I think, which is really important, is the rise of Indian space power. And I'm sure Namrata will talk a lot more about this, so I won't dwell on this. But essentially, since Chandrayaan-3, I think India's star is rising in the space firmament. They have ambitious plans, including for human space flight. And so I think that India is a space power to watch, and India is a space power to engage with. And certainly from an Australian perspective, when we think about the Quad, space is an important aspect of Australian-Indian relations. Third point, you often hear commentators say, oh, we're in a new space race with the Chinese. I don't think that's the correct way to think about things. I think that long-term astro-strategic competition is really what we need to be thinking of. And that revolves not only around what's happening between LEO and GEO in terms of commercial space as well as military space, but also astro-strategic competition for establishing presence and influence and ultimately control around the moon and in cislunar space. And the fourth big theme that I think we need to think about is the move or the transition from Space 2.0, which is the commercialization of space and the ending of the dominance of government-run, taxpayer-funded space programs, from Space 2.0 to what I call Space 3.0, which is the next generation of human space activity that includes space industry, space manufacturing, space-based solar power satellites, space logistics, including on-orbit refuel and repair and upgrading of satellites, and the whole implications of a dramatic fall in the cost of accessing space through reusable launch technologies that were now clearly are emerging as the dominant way of getting payload into space. It's notable that SpaceX did its second test flight for Starship Super Heavy was more successful than the first, and I think they'll do several more. But once that vehicle is fully operational, that has the real potential to utterly transform and disrupt the space launch sector, leading to potential all sorts of applications and new ways of utilizing space that we haven't been able to before, simply because of that high cost of getting payload off the Earth's surface. In terms of space security and the perspectives from Australia, as I said, we're now very much an active provider of space capabilities. We're aiming to be far less dependent on others to provide our space capabilities for us. So we've got a vibrant commercial sector that's providing small satellite technologies, and as I said, we're verging on sovereign launch as well. And sovereign launch, I think, is going to be really critical for Australia because of our favourable geography for launch in terms of our northern territory being very close to the equator. The launch site at Nhulunbuy in the Northern Territory is only 12 degrees south of the equator, so it really enjoys a great deal of benefits in terms of getting payloads into equatorial LEO. So launch is going to be really critical. The satellite sector is going to be really critical, but there's challenges ahead, I think, in terms of ensuring government support. One of the programs that was due to go ahead, called the National Space Mission for Earth Observation, or NSMEO, was cancelled by the current government, and that's caused a lot of disquiet within the Australian space sector. Also of concern is the lack of support from the government for finishing a national space strategy. So I think that we are in a bit of a trough at the moment in terms of uncertainty about government support for the space sector, but that lack of government support does not change the surrounding dynamics of the regional space environment. And this is where we get into the security aspects and the implications of space for defence. And I think that when you look at Australia's perception on Indo-Pacific space dynamics and the importance of space as an operational domain, it's far more sophisticated now in 2023 than it was even 5 years ago. We established in 2022, the Defence Space Command, which took space to another level within the defence organisation, recognised the importance of space as an operational domain, recognised that it's contested as well as congested. And so therefore we have to start thinking about how we can assure access to space and maintain resilient space capabilities. And I think that the move away from passive dependency on others to provide space capabilities for us has been really critical in that regard, because now suddenly we're thinking about how we become an active provider in terms of burden sharing in orbit. That opens up all sorts of possibilities for Australia to work with the United States, US Space Force and US Air Force Space Command, as well as with other key allies in the region, including Japan, South Korea, and India, but also potentially other powers, perhaps including in some ASEAN states. And the primary focus of this discussion in terms of resilience and assured access to space and burden sharing in space is how we respond to the challenge posed by China and the potential risks that a Chinese superpower in space will utilize counter-space capabilities to threaten our access to space. Those counter-space capabilities are growing. Obviously, there's ongoing, well-meaning efforts within international fora to try and use legal, regulatory, and arms control approaches to constrain paths to weaponization and to limit the potential risk of the use of weapons in space. But it doesn't seem to be having much effect on decision makers in Beijing, or for that matter, in Moscow. So Australia, I think, fully supports those international legal regulatory efforts. We signed up to the 2022 unilateral ban on testing of ASATs that would generate debris, which was an easy one for us because we were never going to get kinetic kill ASATs ourselves. But China and Russia have rejected that ban, so that does raise real concerns about just where their intentions lie. I think another challenge for the legal side of things that we're realizing is, how do we enforce space law? How do we attribute violators, and will they care? There's so many assumptions within the space legal community that if we just hold them to account, they'll back down. Well, maybe they won't. Just look at what's happening in Ukraine, where Russia has completely ignored Western pressure to end the war in Ukraine. So I think it's quite possible that even if we try to impose penalties, we may not succeed because we won't get support of the international community. And so therefore, it's quite possible that the Russians or the Chinese could use counter space capabilities against us, including undertake gray zone actions in orbit that would fall below the level that would justify a military response of some kind, and just simply shrug off any legal penalties imposed upon them. So therefore, if that legal and regulatory efforts on our part to constrain space weaponization aren't certain to succeed, then what we need to do is match those efforts with a greater focus on space deterrence. And that can be done through denial as well as resilience. And here's where Australia can play a direct role in terms of burden sharing, in terms of being able to utilize its launch geography, to be able to provide assured access, to be able to augment and reconstitute space capabilities in a crisis with sovereign launch capabilities. So I think that one of the key things that you'll see coming up is greater focus by Australia on working with countries like the US, Japan, South Korea, and India to strengthen space deterrence via resilience, and also to look at the controversial and touchy issue of space control and how we do it. We're not going to go on the offensive, but certainly we're looking at defensive space electronic warfare capabilities. I'm not sure how much time I've got, so I'll push on through. I think that we are moving beyond the traditional approach of simply providing a suitable piece of real estate for ground facilities. We're now openly talking about a space segment or an upstream capability, which is very good to see. And that enables us to burden share with partners and do so much more. And as Jana initially said, Australia's just signed a technology safeguards agreement with the United States that allows US companies to launch rockets from Australia and return those rockets to Australia, the returns being a crucial aspect, because in an era of reusable launch vehicles, you need to be able to recover. So that TSA is important because it opens up all sorts of possibilities for US companies to launch from Australia, including, for example, SpaceX with Starship Super Heavy. You could have the scenario where a Starship launches out of Boca Chica, flies into orbit, delivers its payload, and then re-enters and lands at Nhulunbuy or at Whalers Way in South Australia, is refueled, a new payload put on that launches out of that spaceport, flies into orbit, and then lands back at Boca Chica. Those sorts of possibilities are important. But I think significantly from an Australian perspective, what the TSA does is force the current government or future governments to really support sovereign launch, because having signed it, they have to follow through with action. So I'm much more confident now that we'll move ahead with launch than I was beforehand. And I think that that opens up, that sovereign launch capability opens up our ability to burden share in orbit and play a much more significant role in deterring and defeating space threats, such as the sort of counter space threats that we're now seeing coming out of China that could be a factor in a future conflict. I think I'm probably out of time. I'm happy to take questions, but I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. So I'll give floor to Namrata.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jana, for having me, and it's an honor. And following on what Malcolm has said, what I'm going to do is I'll structure my remarks around the significance of the Indo-Pacific region and why space security is becoming so critical. So when you look at the Indo-Pacific region, it hosts about 40% of global GDP. And in that context, what is being recognized by nations in the Indo-Pacific is that space is a very critical infrastructure in terms of where they are going. And so at the global level and at the regional level, you can see that nations like China, Japan, India, Southeast Asian nations are starting to view space from a very economic perspective. And so that includes not just communication services, navigation services, but they're also looking at cislunar space and beyond. So this is a very critical departure from the Cold War, and it's the post-Cold War structure that we are in. And that has enormous implications for how institutions, regulation, and capability is being structured. So that's number one. That is the global impact of space and how it plays into global and regional capabilities. The second important structure in terms of the Indo-Pacific is the critical dimension of an alignment structure that is occurring as we speak, and that responds to the question you asked, which is, are we in a global space race? So you can see that one of the concerns coming out of conversations from the Indo-Pacific is the critical importance of enabling secure access and also ensuring democracy and freedom of access. So in that context, what happens on Earth, for example, geopolitics, in which you have countries like China asserting territorial claim, for example, in disputed area, for example, the South China Sea, Tibet, Taiwan, has a deep impact on how nations are structuring their space infrastructure. And I'll make this clear by saying that when you think about scenarios like an invasion of Taiwan, for example, or a border conflict with another major space nation, which is India. So both are major spacefaring nations, India and China, and they have a conflict at the border. And so space plays into that particular dimension as well. For example, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, communication, nuclear command control. Both nations are nuclear weapon states. And so in that context, space is a critical force multiplier. And given the focus of nations in the Indo-Pacific for democracy and access to space that remains free, you can see that conversations and capability building is being structured around that key focus. So in that context, what is happening is that if you look at the doctrines and the structures that are put in place, China was the first country to establish a military doctrine that looked at space as an enabler of strategic competition in 2015. And what is even more important, for the first time, Chinese military thinkers started arguing that they are going to take the strategic initiative for multi-domain operations when it comes to space, specifically for our Indo-Pacific nation. This was followed by India establishing a defense space agency in 2019, including an anti-satellite weapon test in 2019, and then Japan, which is the biggest departure of all. So in the National Security Strategy of 2022, Japan clearly mentioned that they are going to invest in multi-domain operations, including offensive capability for the defense of the homeland. And so these are very critical structural developments that are happening in the Indo-Pacific. And this is in response to the question you asked, which is that, is there a strategic alignment happening? And I think what is insightful from looking at the strategic conversations regarding space security are three things. One is that this particular alignment structure, for example, between China and Russia, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the use of space for military communications, ISR, the critical importance of commercial space for defense space capability is suddenly being recognized across the Indo-Pacific. And so you see in 2019, India took the decision, for example, to establish a new Space India Limited. And then fast forward to 2023, post the invasion of Ukraine, India established the Defense Space Capability Institution that basically looked at commercial space, developing launch, communication, navigation, and other facilities, including Indian military officers calling for anti-satellite capability that is not kinetic ASAT, but actually jamming and spoofing. So you can see this kind of conversations becoming even more critical vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific. And then finally, when you look at the Indo-Pacific from that particular security structure, there is a big push for regulation and legal capability development. And this includes the entire dimension of space. And so I would say that when you look at the conversations around space, it's not just limited to Earth orbits, which is a big focus of the conversations, for example, in military space capability, but going much beyond that, going to cislunar space, and including missions to Mars. And in that regulatory structure, what is important is that taking cue from concepts like resource nationalism that China is projecting, territorial claims based on historical legacy and analysis, you can see that countries are starting to create a much more strong structure and normative framework to ensure that legal frameworks remain democratic and that they are actually practical and adapting to the times of today. And then finally, when I look at the domestic level that's happening in the Pacific, there are very interesting developments, and I'll end there and look forward to questions. One, most nations that are major nations in the Indo-Pacific are taking three critical decisions in regard to space. One is that space is part of their society's health, economic health, and is a very key critical infrastructure. China in 2020 declared satellite internet and other capabilities as a critical infrastructure. India, in its 2023 space policy document, pointed out that space is a big enabler for India's domestic health and economic capability and national security. And so that's a very critical dimension. Indonesia, for example, also is starting to talk about how to build space security and capability from its domestic space capability development. So what I see is that at the first level, in the domestic sphere, space is looked at as an enabler of societal health and societal capability. The second important capability that nations in the Indo-Pacific are focusing on is civil space launch. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. You mentioned, Yana, about South Korea. They're establishing their own indigenous space launch capability and are also thinking of missions to the moon today. India is also focusing on building a medium lift and a heavy lift rocket, including reusable capability by the year 2025. They've already tested a prototype of a reusable launch vehicle. And so you can see that what is most important for nations in the Indo-Pacific is to have independent access to space and independent launch capability. Malcolm mentioned Starship. The most important rocket launch capability being developed in the Pacific is the Long March 9. So the Long March 9, which is a Chinese rocket that is able to lift about 150 metric tons to low Earth orbit and 50 tons to Earth-Moon transfer orbit, is become a reusable launch platform today. It was not. It was this year in April that China took the very critical official decision to turn the Long March 9 into a reusable launch capability. And why is that the case? Because they view reusable launch and heavy lift launch capability as a game changer for their long-term space capability. And in that particular space capability, what they are doing is that they are looking at building space-based solar power satellites in space. They're looking at building a lunar research station in collaboration with Russia. And then what is interesting is that the designer of the Long March 9 pointed out that they're going to utilize such capability for dual use purpose as well, which means the military implications of it, the ability to build large orbital structures in low Earth orbit. And this is where my final point comes in. So how does this all launch capability, economic development leads to the concept of security in space? So the final dimension of space in the Indo-Pacific is the national security implication of space. So countries are recognizing that space plays a critical force multiplier for force structure, force deployment, communication, and force projection, which means power projection. And so some of the conversations coming out of China's military circles is that China needs to develop orbital platforms which are large with CubeSats in low Earth orbit enabled by artificial intelligence that is going to have dual function. One is it can create debris removal function, but it can also be used for threatening or countering threats to Chinese satellite or any kind of presence in low Earth orbit. And so the national security dimension of space is becoming an absolutely vital area in the Indo-Pacific. And I'll end with why. Why is it the case that nations are doing that? One is because of the changing, shifting conversations that they hear from the US. We talk a lot about partnership with the US, space security dialogue with the US, but then there are also concerns that given the changing vision and mission of different administrations in the US, for countries in the Indo-Pacific to have independent capabilities in space that can fill the void in case US administrations become isolationist or start viewing their own internal development. And so these are the very interesting structural and unit level influences you see in the Indo-Pacific developing as we move forward. I will answer specific questions on India in case there are some, and give the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Namrata. And before I give floor to Ludwig, I perhaps after Kazuta finishes, you could give us just a very brief U.S. perspective, because like you're saying, the countries in the region are seeking to strengthen their own regional capabilities and alliances. Is U.S. reflecting on this, and is there any kind of implications for the way they're conducting their space partnership, and especially the space security partnerships? Ludwig, we know that the European Union back in 2019 openly declared China a partner, competitor, and systemic rival, a little bit of everything, a little bit of each. However, it seems that recently the rivalry part is becoming a little bit more prominent, and I'm wondering, especially the discussions are how does Europe remain relevant in the Indo-Pacific, if how they should engage. So perhaps you can give us your view on where Europe stands in the Indo-Pacific and where it is heading. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having us here. Indeed, I would like to maybe reflect a bit on the European situation. And as you explained it, there have been statements a few years back. I think there is an important date when it comes to Europe. That is the 24th of February 2022, when the invasion of Ukraine started and the conflict started. I think this has been a game changer in many ways, including attitude to the questions you put forward. Maybe before I start on anything specific, Europe is a special case compared to what we heard before. As you know, we are still, and we will remain to be, nations of Europe, and we have a European Union. We also have states like Norway and Switzerland, but maybe more prominently here also the UK, which are not part of this. So we have a structure that is a national structure. We have a structure that is an EU structure. We have a structure that is intergovernmental through ESA when it comes to space. We have bilateral agreements. And this has been a complexity ever since. Now what we have seen, and this really comes into play since last year, something that was more seen as a commercial and industrial sphere of space, all of a sudden raised questions on where security and defense may fit. And just recently what happened in Israel and Hamas only added to this, and certainly what is happening around Russia and China, and what we just heard from the previous speaker. So the question of autonomy takes center stage, where before it was, as you said, maybe a mix of several things. So certainly if you had to point a vector to it, it moves towards an awareness. I would say today it's more than awareness than action when it comes to security and defense and autonomy ambitions. Now, this happens at the same time when we have a technology disruption. We just heard what it means to maybe have a heavy launcher, and I like the reference to CubeSats and AI and a large orbital infrastructure, solar-based, space-based solar power. So we are in front of something that also in terms of what you can do in space is completely different from anything we have known so far. Now, Europe is about still 20% of the global GDP. So we're talking about half of the number we just heard from the Indo-Pacific region. And there are many questions today in Europe, and I think it's the last question in your series of questions to be discussed here. Where does Europe fit into this overall equation? Now, the one thing we've seen now is that, yes, there are space commands, France, Italy, Germany, UK, that are forming. You have even smaller nations like Luxembourg with a defense space strategy. You have countries like Germany that just published a civilian space strategy. I would call it civilian because at the same time, what we have seen is also the security strategy shaping. And there are some voices that maybe the synergy between the two, to put it careful, is not yet fully understood and realized. At the same time, Germany is the country in Europe that currently is decreasing its space budgets. The strongest economic power of the continent is decreasing the space budget, and that is significant. Now, on top of all of this, with a launcher crisis, as some will frame it in terms used in the press, with no rocket to fly, and we had a lot of emphasis in previous talks on independent access to space, which has always been one of the, if not the headline in Europe, with Ariane 5 well implemented. Today, Europe cannot fly, and we launch Galileo satellites on SpaceX, and that resonates in the system, and that also resonates in the press and on the image that Europe is giving. And we just had a space summit when on minister level, the European Space Agency and the EU came together. And if you look into what came out of the summit, there are movements in the right direction. But if you take, for instance, exploration as an example, well, this is 75 million of existing funds redirected to develop what may become a crew, not a crew, but a cargo vehicle, maybe a crew vehicle eventually. Those are small steps, no steps really on exploration that are significant. Security and defense was not part of the summit. It's not even on that agenda. And I would argue that Europe right now, in all the complexity that there is already, is partially paralyzed by the fact that the launcher crisis has dominated a lot of the debate. And not only the debate on the access to space, but also the use of space, and the use of space not only for security and defense, but also for commercial reasons. One element in this formula certainly is that the competitive industry, where today you see European industries, they supply into developments of partner organizations, partner states, mentioning commercial space stations in the US, where you have European companies lining up, but there is no internal market that do the same. We look into constellations being deployed. Europe making efforts today on what is called IRIS², or secure communications constellation. This is still at birth stage, and in terms of scale, probably not comparable, and yet to come. So there is a true question how Europe will develop anything that is an internal market beyond what there is today, successes, and that is Copernicus and Galileo. It's really something that is the full spectrum of what space can bring. Now, in all of this, I think Europe has to develop its own strengths to be able to be a player in whatever region, with whatever partner, be it towards the US and be it in the Indo-Pacific. And the notion of space for diplomacy, the notion of really using space to connect to other nations, to use it as Artemis is doing, as a vehicle to build partnerships. This is something that on a European level, I think is still to be understood. And without this understanding, I think you cannot really be a strong partner in those regions. And what we did, for instance, in the Institute, we worked on metrics for space power measurement to see, is Europe a space power? How do we compare? How does Europe compare to others? And there is an attempt to put some metrics up and some measurable elements. I can come back to this if there is interest subsequently, but clearly it shows that Europe is not today a space power. It has obviously very successful programs. There's a lot of things to build on, but it doesn't have the full range, and in particular security and defense and exploration, which you will see will exist in all space powers as a strategic element. They do not have the level of development in Europe. Coming to India, We had India, in fact, keynote speech from ISRO at our autumn conference just a few weeks back. A clear sign of what it means, what capabilities there can be, an act now mentality. There's 4 years between getting started on an idea and landing on the moon. There's a very strong political will. There's a very clear agenda and a schedule put forward. If you compare it to what Europe started on what we call revolution space, a high-level report by an advisory group, non-space experts, ministers, government functions, NATO former Secretary General, and others, a very strong call for Europe to wake up and take measures. And if you look into this as an input to the Space Summit of just early November in Sevilla, that is acknowledged, but it is very hard to find an act now in response to such a clear call. And if you look into other metrics and GDP numbers, Europe today is at 0.075% of GDP when it comes to space invest. That compares to 0.25 in the US. There's a factor of 5 to 6 to really compare the public investment. I repeat again, in a situation where Germany is in fact decreasing its public support to space. Overall today, Europe is at 15%. You could ask the question, how can you partner? How can you team up, be a strong partner and act significantly in other regions if you do not secure and maybe improve this element? And that is true for the APAC region. It's certainly true for Africa. There is a strong interest. France has historically been very strong in Africa. You have, for instance, the Portuguese agency very interested in the Portuguese-speaking partners. This is something that is in the discussion. We are still at a step where the question is how concrete and how much funding goes into the realization of this. And maybe as a last remark, 80% of the budgets, the public budgets in Europe are still national budgets. So 80% is still sitting in the nations. So when we say Europe, it's not one Europe. When we say EU, it's 18% today, important 18% for operational programs and important 18% when it comes to maybe diplomacy. But the equation cannot be resolved without resolving the European equation, how the nations work as a whole as Europe on the planet.
Thank you, Ludwig. Well, I've already a number of questions that come to my mind, so I look forward to the discussion. But Kazuto, please give us some overview of Japan. I know Japan has made such significant strides in establishing very strong space security policies and structures. So I know there's a lot to cover. Please.
Right. Thank you, Jana, and thank you very much for inviting me for this second space security Indo-Pacific Space Security Dialogue, and I'm happy to join consecutively from the first one. Just following on what Ludwig has said, Japan is also, although it is right that Japan has striving its national security space strategy, but the problem is that we are facing this very same problem of the European problem, which is a lack of launcher. Japanese new launcher H3, and well, H3 has failed, the first one, and we have identified the problems, but we are hoping that there will be another launch which will take place until March next year. But still, we are not certain that how much that we will be able to gain our capabilities. Also, we have another launcher which is called the Epsilon, and Epsilon has failed. The number 6 has failed, and since then the launcher has renewed to Epsilon S. but Epsilon S is also has not been successful. So we don't have a particular launch, any capable or autonomous launch capabilities. So that has been a problem. Although we have lines of satellite, which is in the backlog, but there are no way to launch them, and we are seeking some of the important satellites, which are including the information gathering satellite, which are practically the reconnaissance satellite, will be launched by the H2A, but we only have the 3 H2A left. So we will not be able to launch anything if the 3 launcher exhausted. So even though we have we are having a very ambitious planning for the national security, we have to come back to the autonomous capability of launchers. Otherwise, we need to seek other launchers to launch our satellites. To the concept of the Space Security Initiative, which is published in June this year, 2023, which is following the strategy, national space strategy in December 2022. This national space strategy includes the long-range attacking counter-strike capabilities, and also it includes the several measures, including the strengthening the missile defense capabilities for the hypersonic gliding vehicles. So these are the 2 major aspects that has boosted the Japanese Space Security Initiative. And we are, for the counter-strike capabilities, this is the first time in our history after the World War II that Japan will have the capabilities to reach to the outside of the Japanese territory. For the constitutional reasons, the Japanese defense was basically structured based on the territorial defense, which means that we are pledged not having the long power projection capabilities, such as aircraft carriers or the long-range missiles. But given the situation in the East Asia, having China emerging as a superpower, the Russia is unpredictable, and North Korea is further unpredictable with the nuclear missiles. So we are now reconstructing our security strategy, so that idea of national security strategy and the subsequent space security initiative are basically to improve the Japanese capabilities to target and to counter-strike if in case of being attacked, for the sake of the deterrence. So in other words, Japan is now reconstructing its concept of the deterrence in the to counter the Chinese capabilities, and especially for preparing for the Taiwan contingency. The Taiwan contingency is practically the first time that Japan is facing the real threat of the disruption of the maritime traffic, and also there will be a potential for the physical attack on the Japanese soil. But furthermore, what is further important is that there is a possible attack on the US bases in Japan. So in this case, Japan will be the target of the Chinese military aggression. It depends on what sort of a type of the aggression that China is going to take, but there is always a potential that if China is trying to exercise its military power to take over Taiwan, then Japan will be Japan cannot be isolated from that incident. So the Taiwan could, for the Taiwan contingency, the best solution for Japan is to increase its deterrence capabilities with the United States to make sure that China will not consider the use of military force to take over Taiwan. So in doing so, the Japanese security strategy aims at to improve the Japanese deterrence capabilities. And together with that, Japan, the Kishida administration is pledged to double the defense spending, which eventually leads to the increase of the Japanese military spending on space for the 1 trillion yen for 5 years, which means about $7 million in 5 years. So that sort of investment will change the dynamics of the Japanese space industry and the space development. So the first set of the target is to aim at to have the 50-some satellite constellation for targeting purposes. Japan currently have the 4 information gathering satellites, which are basically reconnaissance satellites with 2 optical and 2 radar. But this will be increased to the 8, and together with the relay satellites, it will be 10 satellite constellation. But apart from the information gathering satellites, the Ministry of Defense is going to invest in the satellite constellation for targeting, and probably there will be a further investment in the Japanese space startups, which are planning to build the optical and the radar small-sat constellation for reconnaissance. So this will be used for the targeting purposes of the long-range counter-strike capabilities, but also these satellites can function as more detailed minute-to-minute satellite monitoring of the different objects. Also, Japan is planning to join the construction of the missile defense system for the hypersonic gliding vehicle. So Japan has currently in negotiation with the United States for to what extent Japan will join the construction of the certain levels, transportation layers, observation layers, and so on and so forth. Does it construct the space race in space? I think it's a little too awkward to say space is just competing in space. I think the space is independent variable, but also the dependent variables. And currently, the Japanese, well, if you look at the national security strategy of Japan, space is a dependent variable, so that it will change the dynamics based on the changes of the security policy as a whole. So Japan is not seeking to be the space power, nor Japan is trying to dominate space. But the Japanese space activities are basically to serve for its own military capabilities and the security strategy. So that is basically the concept of the current Japanese space programs. At the same time, as in case of Europe, I think apart from launcher problems, we are now facing a lot of the commercial and the cost issues. There are always the conflicts of the interest of how to reduce the cost of developing and constructing the satellite constellations, or to just buy from the foreign companies. And there are very much of the contradiction or the debate over efficiency versus autonomy. Should we have the autonomous capability, or should we have the should we save our money because there are lots of money to invest in so many things. So within the Ministry of Defense and the National Security Secretariat, there are discussions about how to motivate the commercial entities like the space startups to join the military activities or the Japanese defense construction for space, and also to what extent the Japan should rely on the foreign assets and foreign services. For many years, Japan has prohibited to use space for the security purposes. So the mindset of the people in the Ministry of Defense has not changed that much, but gradually there are some people who are arguing that we need to have our own autonomous space capabilities so that we'll be able to have an autonomous space system. The question of the space race goes to the moon exploration, and I think I'll stop here. I'll stop with this subject. The moon exploration is quite different from the US perspective, from a Japanese perspective. The Japanese perspective, joining the Artemis program and to building up, to be part of the building up of the Gateway, which is a lunar space station, which is around the lunar orbit, is not for its exploration to Mars. The Japanese aim is to explore Moon, and in that regard, the ultimate objective is to have the Japanese astronauts landing on the Moon as a first non-American. So this is a great motivation for the Japanese space businesses. But what is interesting is that there are a number of the non-space companies are joining the potential for the moon exploration as for building up the cislunar economic sphere. And this is very much of a mood in Japanese space community that even the non-space companies like construction companies or agriculture companies are looking at moon as a potential destination for the Japanese space program, so that the Artemis program will be the step forward for such cislunar economic sphere creation. But at the same time, we are certainly concerning about the lack of the regulatory framework on the moon about economic activities, and therefore the landing on the moon should be first, and therefore the Japanese private company like iSpace is now collaborating with Japanese government and the Indian government to reach to the moon as the first private entity to explore moon. So this is the sort of a different take of the space race, but it is not about the technical space race or presence in space, but it is about the regulatory issue on the moon for the space race around the moon. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much to all of you for these very, very informative introductory remarks. One of the things that I would probably came a lot in is that, you know, there is, Namrata mentioned, strategic alignment between, you know, countries. And when we ask why is there the strategic alignment, is that because there is a competition and there is a strive for dominance on the part of some of the major players, and that competition is not only for the best national security capabilities or technological superiority, but also for the future global market. So I think what I'd like to do is maybe it's like a two-tranche question. So we recognize that China has implementing what they call the civil military fusion strategy. So that means they're using their private companies to promote national security objectives and project power abroad. Well, how are we doing on understanding, first of all, how to counter such a strategy, and so that's one part of the question. And second, what is the role of the commercial sector? Because, for example, Ludwig mentioned still in Europe, a lot of the investments comes from the government. So at what point and from which perspective the commercial companies have a role? And do the countries in the Indo-Pacific have good strategies to support their private sector to promote their policies and strategies? Because as we've seen, for the first time, I think in 2023, the investments into the space sector on the part of some of the private sector investors is going down for the first time. So what is the future? And Kazuto talked about it a lot vis-a-vis Japan. So there's a lot of thinking going on to what extent can we utilize the private sector, and also frankly to maintain their enthusiasm for what needs to be done. And this is also relevant, of course, for the space security part, the defense part. So I don't know if you'd like to who would like to start.
I can start if you like. Yeah, so before I answer that question, just briefly on the US space strategy that you wanted me to talk about. So what is insightful development in terms of US space policy and strategy is that with the rise of China and with the ability of China to get to the far side of the moon, and also, as you mentioned, China's civil military fusion strategy, its focus on cislunar space, the US has instituted certain doctrinal focus along with certain civil focus. So the US State Department issued the strategic framework for space diplomacy for the first time that the State Department has actually issued such a document, where it talked about the critical importance of building partnerships, also recognizing that the two main challenges for space security are China and Russia. So it's very clearly stated in the document. Following that, what is interesting, and that has been mentioned several times, is that beyond Earth orbit, there is also the Artemis Accord that wants to go together to the moon. And you have about 32 nations that have signed it. And I think one of the biggest win for US strategic diplomacy was the signatory country, India. So the fact that India signed the Artemis Accord in June was a big win in terms of the Indo-Pacific. Japan is, of course, one of the foundational members of the Artemis Accord. Australia signed it too. So there are these efforts. My concern, despite these efforts, including the focus on building regulatory frameworks, is that the vision and the push is not at the highest level. You have a lot of all these conversations about how space is so critical, how space focus is so important, but there are divergences in terms of the actual communication. And this was mentioned by the previous speaker. So while the US is very much focused on developing cislunar or let's say moon capabilities, because they see the moon as a stepping stone to Mars, the strategic conversations of signatory nations like India and Japan are very different. India views the moon as critically significant for its own sake. They do not connect it to their Mangalyaan mission, which is their Mars mission. So the Chandrayaan-3 that enable India to showcase an ability to soft land on another celestial body for the first time, the southern hemisphere of the moon, was a capability that has been in development since 2007. And finally accomplished in this year. So, and that's number one in terms of divergences. The second divergence is that while there is a lot of conversation in terms of space traffic management, in terms of cislunar capability, when you look at actual doctrinal focus, cislunar is not within the range of the United States Space Force. So if you look at their doctrinal focus, it's a lot about digitalization of force structures. It's a lot about how space is a support force multiplier. And then when you think about where their cislunar capability is, they do not even look at it as a priority. They only look at the orbit of Earth and what it can do for missile defense, what it can do for communication. So there is a big divergence, because other nations in the Indo-Pacific are looking at the moon and actually establishing capability, including thinking as to why the moon is critical from a security perspective. If you look at Chinese thinking on the moon, it is not the same as the US thinking on the moon. For Chinese space scientists and military thinkers, it's a lot about how the moon is going to be a force enabler and a strategic asset for China's power projection capability and cislunar operational capability. And they're very clear as to why they are focusing on developing the moon. It's not to send the next taikonaut. It's not to send the next, for symbolic purposes, woman to the moon. It's really about economic and military advantages. And they're talking about lunar resources, lunar utilization. And so I think that's where the entire departure comes. And I think finally, in terms of US space policy and strategy, I think within administrations, while there seems to be a continuation in regard to the Artemis Accord and the establishment of the Space Force, the language and the narrative do not reflect sometimes the language and the narrative of their partner nations. And this is very clear when you see in conversations, while the US talks about them being the leader or us being the leader in space, when it comes to actual implementation of policy, I see a lack of focus and vision and concentrated effort. That could be because the US does not have a singular body that looks at space, unlike India. India has a Department of Space. Space is under the Prime Minister's office. So there is an extreme focus in terms of schedule meeting, in terms of national will that Ludwig talked about, and also in terms of bringing down the cost of launch. And then I'll answer the question you asked as to how are they utilizing commercial sector. So let's take the case of India, and I'll end there. So what was astounding to me following India for the last 20 years in terms of space and strategic policy was that in this year, India instituted their official space policy for the first time as a nation. And what was insightful was that the entire space policy was about supporting the commercial space sector. It was not about the Indian Space Research Organization. It was not about continuing a state-funded space program. The realization, including in my fieldwork to India, was that India recognized that there are three things India needs to do. One is to build a heavy lift launcher. That is India's challenge. India does not have the capability to launch 25 tons to low Earth orbit that the Long March 5 that China has does. And that limits your ability to build larger platforms in space. So the idea is that we need to encourage, the Indian thinking is that, in quotes, we need to encourage the private space sector to be building such launchers. And India has already now established such launcher capability with Skyroot Aerospace and others. So there's a huge focus. The second important thing that India did to encourage the private space sector is to ensure that there is absolute clarity in regard to the regulatory framework. So this was the biggest concern of Indian space startup, was that the regulatory framework was not supportive, funding was not clear where they're coming from. India's made all that very clear. The New Space India Limited will be the organization that will have fund. InSpace will be the regulatory body, and Department of Space will be the overarching policy-making body. So you can see that there is a big focus and a desire to support space startups, and then there is a push for it from the regulatory and policy documentation as well. And then I'll finally end by saying that this does not just limit itself to civil space. The Indian Prime Minister, for example, announced last year a defense space initiative where he included 75 different technologies from the private space sector to be developed for the enabling of space power projection. Now, the concerns in regard to this, and I'll end there, is that most of the countries in the Indo-Pacific are very much focused on China for good reasons, because most of them have disputes with China. Most of them have border conflicts with China. Most of them recognize that China is in a position to limit the import of very precious minerals and resources, including from space, and has the ability to destroy space assets with its anti-satellite counter-strike capability. Given that, there is a big push for the independent development of capability to their commercial space sector. And that's what I see in terms of the response to your question, that there is actually a push in these particular nations for the development of their commercial space capability. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Malcolm, how about in Australia? You mentioned some, basically reduction of investments into space. How does that reflect on the commercial sector and their kind of vision for their involvement in the future of Australian space sector and space security sector?
Well, look, I think you've got to see it in the context of a change of government. The previous government was the government that really started Australia's significant involvement in space after many decades of space being essentially a non-area for Australia. I mean, if you go back to the 1950s, obviously we were involved in Woomera with the British launching vehicles like Europa and so forth, and then we just let it all go. And that had been, we'd been passively dependent on others to provide space capabilities for us. We provided some ground facilities, but there was no Australian space capability up until about probably 2015, 2017, when things started to change with the previous government. They recognized the importance of space as an operational domain in its own right. They recognized the potential opportunities that came with Space 2.0 and the commercialization of space. They recognized that Australia could be an active participant in this rapidly growing global space sector, and that would generate national prosperity, jobs, growth, and so forth. So you had this sudden switch from about 2015 through 2017, where at the International Astronautical Congress, the government announced the establishment of the Space Agency. I was there. There was a huge cheer in the room because the entire space community of Australia was there, and they got what they wanted, which was a space agency that was stood up in 2018. And things went very well from that point onwards, right through to about 2022, when you had a change of government. And the new government comes in and says, well, look, all of these initiatives are the previous government's initiatives, so we're not going to support them. And so what you've seen is the current Australian government cut funding to a whole series of programs related to launch. You've seen, obviously, the cancellation of the $1.2 billion National Space Mission for Earth Observation, which was a huge blow to Australia's space sector. You've seen the suspension of work on the national space policy, which was meant to be a national space strategy. Sorry, Siri is talking to me and interrupting me. And so there is real concern in terms of just where this is going with the current government and what other changes could occur. And I think it's important to distinguish that the negative stuff, that the cancellations and funding cuts are occurring in the industry, science and resources portfolio, not in the defense portfolio. Look at defense, they are much more switched on to space. The defense minister is much more pro-space than the industry, science and resources minister. So there's real concern that you have a minister in industry, science and resources that just isn't interested in space or doesn't understand it. Whereas defense is far more aware of the significance of space in terms of being a contested operational domain, a potential warfighting domain, the importance that we need to work with our allies and partners to deter China from using counter space capabilities and to defend our assets there and to have resilient, assured access to space. So where does this all go in the future? I think the TSA, as I said, is a very good move because it forces the current government to support space launch. I think that the development of space launch in this country, I think, is a good thing because it takes advantage of our geography. But once you have launch, once you have Australian launch vehicles flying off the pad with payloads going into orbit, that forces the government then to recognize that they can't turn the clock back, they can't cancel it. So I think we need to get over this trough of where we're at now to actually get deliverables clearly displayed to the Australian people, to inspire them and to make them recognize that space is an important area. Once we get past that, then I think we're going forward very smoothly, and we have all sorts of opportunities in terms of working with NASA and the Americans with Project Artemis. We support that as part of the Artemis Accords with our Moon to Mars program. We're sending a rover to the moon in 2026. I think there's increasing support within the country for ultimately having Australian astronauts on the lunar surface with Australian flags on their spacesuits, not US flags. Because up until, basically in the past, Australian citizens have had to become US citizens in order to go into space, which is unacceptable. So the defense aspect is really important. The civil aspect is really important. We're in a bit of an uncertain period at the moment, but I think we'll get out of it. And I think the future is looking very positive indeed.
Good. Ludwig, you mentioned something interesting, that if you look at Europe's internal market, that potentially this won't be sufficient to support the interest in commercial companies to engage in space, if I understood it correctly. But so how do you see that competitiveness of European companies vis-a-vis then counterparts, for example, in Asia? And where are we on that, on the support of our commercial sector?
Yes, I would distinguish two things. One is commercialization, and the other is industry base. I would argue in a situation where space investments globally, that's not the case just in Europe, is 85% public, and we just had clear statements on political will, the benefit of a single voice in some regions more than in others maybe. These 85%, they are the drivers, and they will be the drivers for some time to come. Now, commercialization is a means to an end. If it helps, if it can deliver launchers more effectively, it will be used, like what is happening in the US. And do not forget, there were $4 billion upfront for SpaceX to get to a Falcon 9. That's a story in itself. So commercialization, if I wanted to be provocative, it's overrated. What is underrated is the importance of industrial base. You need to have your industry to do whatever you will be doing, you want to do. If you do not have the people and the companies and the technologies, the innovation at hand that you need to respond to political will and ambition, you will not be able to do it. So the industrial base is key. It can be nurtured by public money and by commercial dynamics. It should be done by both, but I would really keep this separate. Now, coming back to an internal markets everywhere that's not space specific, they are important for any industrial base to have a market to deliver into. That is true in all industry segments, and Europe is a big market. I mean, but Europe is a big economy. If you look into GDP size, this is a big player without any doubt, except that when it comes to space, it is very fragmented. And when it comes to space, there is no political will that creates the contracts and the the procurements that you have in other regions. And if you keep that like that, and other regions are stepping up, and the demand is generated elsewhere, the industries will deliver elsewhere, which is fine for a while. But the point will come when these industry will have become dependent on foreign markets. They can be captured by the markets. They can actually be migrated and merged and disappear from your European autonomous ambition. So I really would like to distinguish this, and why this is so much a European point is that in Europe, we do not scale up when everybody scales up. And if you do not scale up, you get into dynamics that don't give you the prosperity.
Thank you. Kazuto, you already talked a lot about Japan's thinking on to what extent, what role the commercial companies should have. what would you think is the priority vis-a-vis support for the commercial sector and the recognition of the importance of the public-private partnership for some of the security challenges that Japan faces?
Well, I think Japan is in a transitional phase at this moment with regard to the private-public partnership. But first of all, the traditional space industry like Mitsubishi Heavy, Mitsubishi Electric, or NEC, these are now being basically the contract receiver from the large-scale space program, but the Japanese the Japanese space policy and the space funding have not focused on the space startups, which are basically the commercial entities. But following the Ludwig's comments, I think there is a certain perception in Japan that these commercial startups will be the ones that creates widen the community of the space industrial base and the space industrial capabilities. So the Japanese government this year has launched this initiative called the SBIR, the Small Business Investment. I forgot what the R stands, but this is basically the a pool of money which are basically investing for the startups, and most of the Japanese small startups receive this very base funding for the first time. That is recognized as a potential technology creator and market creator in the Japanese economy as a whole, not just only a space economy. And also the JAXA the government has decided to build up a 1 trillion yen, which is about $7 million, pool of funding or endowment for JAXA to manage the investment in the basically the startups or the new technologies that can be commercially applicable. So this sort of a driving force for the commercialization of the Japanese space industry based on that industrial basis. But I think there is a sort of a mixture of ideas of the commercialization leads up to the building up and strengthening the industrial base. And this industrial base will be the foundation for the Japanese space security activities. So what happened is that apart from SBIR and the JAXA managed strategic endowment, the Japanese defense spending will be dedicated for the 1 trillion and $5 million for 5 years for the defense programs. So these three funding mechanisms will come together strategically to build up the Japanese industrial capabilities for both commercialization and the security use of space.
Thank you. As you know, PSSI, one of the areas that we are researching very intensively is how are we positioned? That means European countries, US, and their partners in the Asia Pacific, is in what we label the ground-based space race. That is, how are we partnering with other countries with tangible offers of support for development of their space program versus China and Russia? As you know, China and Russia have been very active, and China in particular, in providing space equipment, technologies, launch capabilities, ground segment, as well as financing to other countries. How do we view ourselves? Are we attractive partners to other countries in the region, in the Asia-Pacific region, but also in Africa, in Latin America? Where are we? And where is, for example, Australia? Where is India and Japan? Do we view ourselves as an attractive partner to these countries? Are we offering tangible benefits? And is there any collaboration among us to partner with other countries? Maybe Namrata.
Yeah, sure. That's the key question as to, are we, for example, is the US and the European Union an attractive partner? So especially when it comes to regions that do not get the focus that it actually should, right? As you mentioned, Africa and Latin America. So if we let's take the specific case of the US and how it is trying to build partnerships in Africa, and how does Africa view the US in terms of space? So in terms of the concrete example of the Artemis Accord, you have Nigeria that has signed the Artemis Accord, and I think Rwanda. The interesting departure is South Africa. South Africa, during the BRICS summit this year, signed the China International Lunar Research Station. So clearly projecting and telling the US that the partner of choice is China. So, and the reasons are clear, because China, as you mentioned, includes space capability, launch systems, telemetry, satellite within the Belt and Road Spatial Information Corridor, which means once a nation signs and becomes a member, you get subsidized rates, but you also get loans in terms of different capability you are developing. And so there is a clear focus in terms of where nations would go. And I think what I find quite telling in the Chinese thinking is that, and the African thinking, is that there are calculations made as to who is going to be the more reliable, sustainable partner in the long term. Because if you look at projections of the world economy, Nigeria has good reasons to invest in space. It's going to become the 14th economy in the world. It's not going to remain what it is today. There is a huge young population hungry for innovation, for talent, for science. And I'm astounded and very, very impressed with the level of capability that I see coming out of Africa and Latin America. I think in that particular competition, the US has not played the game yet, is my perspective. So while there is the African summit that happened with President Biden, and the African focus was a lot on innovation and engineering, science, space, the US still tends to, and while recognizing that economic and commercial partnership is the way to go, there is also this country-specific conditioning that comes in, right? And that creates sometimes obstacles in terms of partnering. In case of India, which is interesting, and if you talk about space and the larger grand strategic framing, India has taken a decision to invest about $50 billion by 2030 in Africa, and which includes science and technology. India was the country that got the African Union to become a permanent member of the G20. So which means the African Space Agency, which is part of the African Union, will be included. These are very concrete institutional steps of partnership building, but which is not just rhetoric. It is being followed by commitments in terms of financial investment. India seems to be an attractive partner, and which is why India joining the Artemis Accord has great strategic significance beyond just partnering with the US. It gives legitimacy, first of all, to the Artemis Accord. And second, in my conversations with African Union space agencies, what I get is that they view India as a very viable model. Unlike the US space industry is extremely expensive. $54 billion investment. The space launch system itself costs $4 billion. We do know that Starship's production cost is going to go up, whereas the Indian model is a much more economically viable model, where they're able to do an entire end-to-end system, which includes launch and going to orbit and then going to the moon within a $75 million budget. Right. And so the African countries and Latin American countries are actually looking at India as a model because it sees that as something they can sustain. And then I'll finally end by saying that one point which Ludwig mentioned is really critical, which is that in all these partnerships and all these conversations, what really matters is financial commitment. So it's not just about building regulatory framework, it's also about how much money and how much technology transfer and innovation are you willing to commit to have an actual substantial and authentic partnership, right? And sometimes in the US, regulations like IATAR can create issues of partnership. India is working very hard to undo such obstacles. And I think that will matter in who is going to be the more attractive partner in the long term.
Thank you. Malcolm, do you have any view on this?
Not really that much to add because Namrata really covered the area so well, but I think that from Australia's perspective, we don't do an awful lot with Africa or, for example, South America. I mean, sort of our focus is very much on engaging with Indo-Pacific states. And I think that South Korea, Japan, and India are going to be our areas of focus. So, you know, the success of Chandrayaan-3, I think is really important. South Korea's successful launches really open up potential there for Australia to work with South Korea. And next week I'm heading up to the Gold Coast to participate in a workshop on South Korea and Australian space industry cooperation. So things are happening in that regard. And I think that that's where our focus is going to be in the region. I don't really see us doing much beyond that. Obviously, we have engagement with Europe as important, but I take Ludwig's point that things are moving very slowly in Europe in terms of space. So that's a challenge for us as well. We want to surge ahead. And so we want partners that can surge with us in that sense. And I think that's why South Korea, Japan, and India are the key three, in addition to the United States, that we focus on.
Thank you. Ludwig, how about Europe? And I know France, for example, like you say, has been very active in Africa and European Union as well. So are we well positioned in these countries? Namrata mentioned Nigeria, for example. But how are we doing?
Yeah, in fact, I'd like to come back to a point that Namrata made, which I think is maybe the key takeaway for myself from the discussion. And it may sound banal, but this one political voice, and it was in relation to India, and it may be also elsewhere. If you come back from the Emirates or you look into what's happening in Saudi Arabia elsewhere, you almost get the feeling that it's a handicap for established space powers or strong spacefaring nations at a time when policy meets space. Because the whole space system in those established ecosystems is not trained on it, and it has its own agenda, and maybe that agenda is not the right and the complete agenda anymore. You may actually miss the point. You talk about stuff that doesn't really matter to those that enter space coming from the political end. The space is part of a bigger package. It is from policy to space and not from space to policy. And that makes everything, when you talk about partnerships with Indo-Pacific, and you talk with partners that have a different perspective, and again, Namrata said it, they may meet and they may not talk the same language because they take it from two different ends. So if I translate this into Europe, I think we are part of this, we're suffering from that. We have established industries, we have strong nations, France being one and others, that there's a lot of capability in the system. There's a lot in the system. It may be fragmented, yes. But it's not only to get it together. I think it's about the new narrative. It is really about to get it on the policy agenda. It is policy to discover space as much as any transformative future enabling technology and innovation. It's part of a package. And this whole mindset of future and technology and innovation as an element of future in Europe is maybe the biggest caveat. It's not a space-specific problem. It is not a security-specific problem. It is deeper. But this is so much work to be done. I think we need, it would be maybe my last statement of it, I talk about Europe, this is what we need to do. We need to bring it to Berlin and to Paris and to Rome and all the capitals and the governments and explain that from the top and not from the bottom, not from the supply side, from the demand side.
Thank you. Kazuto, how about Tokyo? I know Tokyo is very active in reaching out to partners, so maybe a good role model. What do you think?
Well, basically, I fully agree with what Ludwig said. I think the demand side issue is extremely important. Therefore, the Japanese government has established something called the Overseas Task Force, which is to explore the possibility of finding what are the demands and try to fit the demands to the supplies. So I think, yes, I agree with Ludwig that there need to be a change of narratives and the way in which that our ecosystem is fit for the demand. The good chances are we are currently focusing on the building up the startup capabilities. The startups may have difficulties, but I think there are a lot of startups in the United States. They are providing services and providing generating revenues. But I think these supply of services are coming from the sort of the Western American perspective and their economic structure. So it doesn't really fit to the demand of the countries in Africa, countries in Latin America. So what Japanese Overseas Task Force is doing is to try and find the possibility that we can connect with those demand for the new startups, because this is going to be the new blue ocean that we can explore the possibility of commercializing the Japanese space technologies and the Japanese space industrial bases, and this will make the Japanese space industry more resilient to because of the expanding its market in the developing countries. So since we have the established ecosystem of the spaces, the space industry with together with the public-private partnership with traditional space industry, but this new space industry are having a lot of potentials which can work together with the countries in Africa, Latin America, Middle East, Southeast Asia, etc. So these task forces, and we set up the task force 3 years ago, and this is the 3rd year of this of task force, and which is renewing the objective of the task force. Well, each year there are new tasks are set by the task force to explore the possibility for the small startups to work together with the relevant agencies in the African countries. These relevant agencies does not necessarily be the space agencies. It can be a Ministry of Forestry or Ministry of Agriculture. And one of the successful cases is that the collaboration with Philippines. One of the Japanese universities program was linked with the Ministry of Agriculture and the Science and Technology in Philippines to provide the satellite, which uses multi-spectrum sensors to identify the change of colors of the leaves of the bananas. So that is one of the case that we'll be able to connect, not for the space-to-space sake, but the space to applications or space to demand. And I think this sort of an effort takes a lot of effort. Well, it takes a lot of effort to build up this relationship, but I think there are certain opportunities, and that's not only about the finances, or that's not, that's something that falls out of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you. Thank you, Kazuto, and thanks to all of you. Regrettably, we ran out of time, so we don't have time for any more questions. So again, many thanks to our inspiring speakers and to all of you for being with us today. We look forward to staying in contact with you as we plan our future gatherings, including our upcoming 7th PSSI Space Security Conference in June 2024 in Prague. So this concludes our proceeding. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to staying in contact with you.
Thank
Bye
you
now.
for. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you. Bye-bye.